There is a heart in the cooler between Cyrus Osman's feet. He knows everything about it. Male donor, 41 years old, blood type O negative. Harvested at 11:08 p.m. at Cleveland Clinic. Ischemic tolerance, for hours from harvest to implantation. That window opened 93 minutes ago. He knows less about the man waiting for it in Detroit, only what the system tells him. 56 years old, 3 years on the list. This was the match they had been waiting for. Cyrus has coordinated 112 organ transports in 6 years. He has never lost a heart to the clock. He has also never been sitting in a helicopter in an ice storm over Lake Erie at 12:41 a.m. with a pilot who just said for words that Cyrus is still processing, "We can't make it." Remy Fontenot had flown in worst. Afghanistan. 2014, a dust storm so thick he navigated by instrument alone for 40 minutes, with 2 critical patients in the back and no margin for anything. A night in the Gulf of Mexico, civilian contract, when a rig worker with a crush injury needed to get to Baton Rouge and the weather window was a lie. Someone told him over radio he'd made it both times. He was not going to make it to Detroit tonight. The ice was the problem, not the storm itself, but the type. Freezing rain at altitude. The specific conditions that accreted on rotor blades in a pattern that heat systems could slow, but not stop. He had 19 minutes, maybe 22, before he needed to be on the ground. Detroit was 43 minutes away. The math was simple. The math was the worst kind of simple. He keyed the radio and gave the declaration calmly. The way he gave everything. His voice in the cockpit the same as his voice at a dinner table. Unhurried, exact. He told Detroit Medical Center that he was diverting. He told them where he was going to land. He told them to figure out ground transport. Then he looked at the man in the co-pilot seat. Cyrus Osman was 34 years old, Iranian-American, with the particular stillness of someone who had trained themselves to stay functional in the moments when functionality was the only thing standing between an outcome and a catastrophe. He was holding the cooler's handle with both hands. He was looking out the window at the ice forming on the windshield. He had not said anything since Remy's for words. Baltimore County Airport, Remy said. It's a small regional grass strip, 1 building. It's 40 miles from Detroit Medical Center. Ground transport is, he paused. Ground transport is going to be a problem tonight. Cyrus turned from the window. He looked at Remy with eyes that were doing calculations Remy couldn't see. How long do we have? He said. On the organ? Yes. Remy looked at the cooler. You know that number better than I do. 2 hours and 27 minutes, Cyrus said. He said it like a fact he was choosing to speak rather than hold. From right now. Remy nodded. Ground transport in this weather. The roads between here and Detroit are. He checked his instruments. Michigan State Police has a bulletin on I-94. Accidents. Ice. They're estimating 2 to 3 hours for emergency clearance, so it's not going to make it. Cyrus said. It was not a question. I don't know that yet. Remy said. You can tell me the truth. Remy looked at him for a moment, one real look. In the frozen dark above Lake Erie, the ice on the windshield and the cooler between them and the clock that neither of them could stop. I don't know yet, he said again. And I don't say things I don't know. Baltimore County Airport was a single runway, a windsock, and a low metal building with the lights on inside because Remy had called ahead. He put the helicopter down with the focused economy of a man who had landed in worse places than this, in worse conditions than this. And then he killed the engine and the rotors wound down and the silence of a Michigan field. And an ice storm came in around them. Cold, dark, the sound of freezing rain on the fuselage. Inside the building, a man named Gerald who ran the airport and was 63 and had lived in this county his whole life and had the weather radio on and had already called the state police by the time they came through the door. Roads are bad, Gerald said. He had the particular directness of someone who understood that. The situation didn't require softening. I-90 for eastbound is closed at the Ypsilanti Junction. State police says 2 hours minimum. Cyrus looked at the cooler in his hands. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he set it on the table. Carefully, the way you set down something that matters. And took out his phone and began making calls. Remy watched him work. He called Detroit Medical Center, the transplant coordinator on the other end. A woman named Angela, who he spoke to with a speed and precision that suggested they had been through difficult calls before. He called Michigan State Police Dispatch. He called the hospital's emergency administrator. Each call lasted under 90 seconds. Each one ended with Cyrus having extracted exactly the information he needed, and having given exactly the information the other person needed. No more, no less. He worked the phone the way Remy worked the controls, without waste. After the 4th call, he set the phone on the table beside the cooler and stood very still for a moment. 2 hours 10 minutes, he said. On the organ, the fastest ground option is a state police escort from the Ypsilanti Junction. When they clear it, ETA 1 hour 40. That gets us to Detroit Medical in 2 hours 5. 5 minutes short, Remy said. 5 minutes short. He said it with a flatness that contained something enormous. There's a HEMS unit at University of Michigan Hospital in Ann Arbor. They're grounded, same ice conditions. There's a fixed wing option out of Willow Run, but the runway there is, he checked his phone. Also closed. Gerald had gone quiet on the other side of the room, understanding, without being told, that he was witnessing something that required space. Cyrus sat down in one of the plastic chairs along the wall. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the floor. Remy sat in the chair beside him, not across the room. Beside him. Tell me something, Remy said. Cyrus looked up. What something about him? The man waiting. Cyrus was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved slightly. I don't usually know much, he said. The system, we use identifiers, not names, until after. Protects the process. He paused. But tonight the receiving coordinator told me. She shouldn't have. But she told me. He has a daughter. 8 years old. He's been on the list since she was 5. The freezing rain against the windows. He coaches her soccer team from his hospital bed, Cyrus said. He watches the games on a tablet. His daughter draws him pictures of the trophies they're going to win when he's better. The room was very quiet. Okay, Remy said. He stood up. He picked up his radio. He walked to the window, looked out at the runway, at the helicopter, at the ice, at the dark field beyond the lights. Cyrus watched him. What are you thinking? Cyrus said. I'm thinking about the rotor de-icing system, Remy said, and the wind pattern off the lake, and whether the ceiling is where the radar says it is or whether the radar is slightly wrong. He turned from the window. I need 20 minutes to check something. Don't call anyone else yet. Remy. 20 minutes, Remy said. Give me 20 minutes before you make the call to Angela. Cyrus looked at him. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, 20 minutes, Remy said. He went back out into the ice. Gerald made coffee. He brought it out without being asked to cups, set them on the table next to the cooler, then went back to his desk and his weather radio and did not look at Cyrus again. Because Gerald had been running this airport for 22 years, and he understood that some nights required simply being present without interfering. Cyrus wrapped his hands around the cup. He looked at the door Remy had gone through. He had been doing this job for 6 years. He had worked with hundreds of pilots, good ones, careful ones, cautious ones, and the ones who were cautious about the wrong things and reckless about the right ones. He had learned to read them quickly because his job required it. The pilots who would push were usually easy to spot, and usually, they were the ones he trusted least. Remy Fontenot he could not read. He was calm in the way that people were calm when the calm was structural, built into the architecture of them rather than applied on top of it. He had declared the diversion without drama or apology, which was correct. He had landed in a dark field on a grass strip in an ice storm, with the apparent effort of parallel parking. When Cyrus had said, "Tell me the truth," he had not pretended the math was better than it was. He had also said, "I don't say things I don't know." Cyrus was still thinking about that. He had spent 6 years in a job that required him to know, to have the information, to manage the information, to be the person who held the numbers and the timelines and the contingencies, so that everyone else could do their part. He did not say things he didn't know either. He had learned painfully the cost of filling the space with optimism rather than data. He looked at the cooler. 112 transports. 112 times he had moved something irreplaceable from the place it ended to the place it needed to begin. He had thought about what it would feel like to lose one. He had run the scenario in his mind the way you ran the scenarios that you needed to be ready for, without wanting them to happen. He had not expected it to feel like this. Not the logistics, not the failure, the specific weight of a daughter drawing pictures of trophies her father might not be alive to hold. The door opened. Remy came back in with ice in his hair, and his hands red from the cold, and an expression that Cyrus couldn't immediately translate. Talk to me, Cyrus said. Remy sat down. He picked up his coffee. He took a drink and seemed to decide something. The ceiling is higher than the radar is showing, he said, by approximately 400 feet. The freezing level is at 2,200 feet, not 1,800. The accretion rate on the rotors in those conditions. With the de-icing running at full, he paused. I can make 40 miles. I cannot make it back. Cyrus stared at him. That's a one-way trip, he said. Yes, you'd be landing a helicopter in Detroit with compromised rotors, the Detroit Medical Center. Helipad is a controlled landing environment. I'd have help on the ground. The rotors would be manageable, Cyrus said. It's the honest word. Remy, Cyrus said his name like it meant something. You could die. I could have a hard landing. He said it with the flatness of someone parsing a risk they'd already processed. It's not the same as dying. It's not the same as safe now. He looked at the cooler. Nothing about tonight is safe. The freezing rain on the windows. Gerald's weather radio, low in the corner, giving numbers that neither of them were listening to anymore. You came back inside to ask my permission, Cyrus said. Remy looked at him. I came back inside to tell you the option. You already decided. A pause. I decided I wanted you to know the full picture before anything else happened. Why? Because it's your transport. Because that. He looked at the cooler. That's yours? This whole night is yours. I'm the pilot. You're the one who carries it. Cyrus looked at him for a long time. In 6 years. He had worked with pilots who saw the organ as cargo, the patient as a number. The transport is a logistics problem. He had worked with pilots who were moved by it in ways that made them less reliable. He had learned to prefer the ones who were somewhere between, who understood what they were carrying without letting it override their judgment. He had never worked with anyone who said it's yours and meant it as an act of respect rather than an abdication. If we go, Cyrus said. I'm in the co-pilot seat. I know. Tell me everything I need to do if something goes wrong on approach. Remy looked at him. Something moved in his face, an assessment that went deeper than the professional. You know how to fly. I know how to follow instructions, Cyrus said. Instruct me. They were airborne at 1:30 for AM. The ice was there, immediate, present. The rotor de-icing working against it with the sound of a system under sustained effort. Remy flew with both hands on the controls and his eyes moving continuously between the instruments, and the windshield and the radar, and the altimeter, and he narrated everything, the way he'd said he would, quiet, precise. A continuous low voice that told Cyrus exactly what was happening and what each reading meant. Cyrus listened. He had the cooler in his lap now, his arms around it, which was not protocol, but was what he needed to do, and Remy had said nothing about it. Ceiling holding, Remy said. A correction at the predicted rate. We have sufficient margin. How sufficient? Enough. He paused. I don't overstate margins. I know, Cyrus said. At 23 minutes. The lights of Detroit became visible, the sprawl of them, the river, the bridge to Windsor. The particular geography of a city seen from the air in winter. Sparkling and cold and completely indifferent to the helicopter moving toward it. With ice on its rotors, Detroit Medical Center helipad, Remy said. 7 minutes. How are the rotors? A pause. Ask me again in 7 minutes, Remy said. Cyrus looked at him. At the profile of him in the cockpit light, the steadiness of his hands, the set of his jaw, the eyes that moved and never stopped moving because that was the job in this. Was the man, and they were 40 miles from where this night had started, and 7 minutes from where it needed to end. Remy, he said. Yeah. I need you to know something. Tell me after we land. I need to tell you now. A beat. The rotors. The ice. Okay, Remy said. Whatever happens in the next 7 minutes. What you did tonight, he stopped. Started again. You didn't have to make this flight. You had a completely defensible reason to stay on the ground. Nobody would have questioned it. He paused. You're going to get me there. And when you do, I need you to know that I understand what that cost. Remy was quiet for a moment. We're not there yet, he said. I know, Cyrus said. I'm saying it now anyway. The lights of the hospital were visible. The helipad illuminated, a team moving on it. Someone had called ahead and they were ready. 2 minutes. You're 113th. Remy said. Cyrus looked at him. You said 112. Remy said. I was counting. 1 minute. The landing was hard. Not catastrophically. Not the crash that Cyrus had been holding the shape of in his chest for the past 40 miles. Hard. The helicopter touched down with an impact that jarred through the frame, and Remy's hands moved through a sequence. So fast Cyrus couldn't track it, and then they were still. And the rotors were winding down, and the ground team was moving toward them. And Cyrus's hands were on the cooler, and his heart was going to stay in his chest. Go. Remy said. His voice was very controlled. Go. They're waiting. Cyrus went. The heart reached the operating room at 3:02 a.m. 115 minutes remaining in the ischemic window. Cyrus knew this because Angela told him. Outside the OR doors, with the particular expression of a colleague who has been through a near miss and is still processing the near. She gave him the numbers, which was the professional language they both spoke, the language that meant we made it. The system held. And then she looked at him and said, How did you get here? Carefully, he said. He found Remy in the hospital's family waiting area on the 2nd floor. Not because anyone had directed him there. Because it was the kind of place that was quiet at 3 in the morning. And Remy Fontenot was the kind of person who found the quiet place. He was sitting in a chair by a window with his jacket still on and his eyes on the Detroit River, visible in the distance, dark and moving under the bridge lights. His hands were in his lap. They were shaking, not much. The fine tremor of someone whose adrenaline had been running at a specific level for a specific amount of time and had now made the transition to the aftermath, which the body handled in its own way, on its own schedule. Regardless of what the professional surface wanted. Cyrus sat down beside him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have an immediate opening that felt equal to the moment, so he didn't manufacture one. He sat, and he looked at the river, and he let Remy's hands shake without commenting. After a while, the shaking stopped. "How is it?" Remy said. "In surgery. 115 minutes to spare." Remy nodded. He looked at the river. "The rotors," Cyrus said. "After we landed, I saw the ground team looking at them. They'll need inspection before the helicopter flies again." Remy said. "Possibly component replacement." He paused. "Nothing that isn't fixable. And you?" "I'm fixable too." He said it without irony. "Just fact." Cyrus looked at him. At the profile of him in the window light. The same profile he'd been looking at for the past 3 hours in the cockpit, in the small building in the field, in the dark above Lake Erie. "You shook when we landed," Cyrus said. "I know. Not before." "I know. Why after?" Remy turned from the window. He looked at Cyrus with eyes that were different than the cockpit. Not more open, exactly. More present, like the thing that had been occupied entirely by the flying had room now for something else. "Before, there's the problem," Remy said. "The problem takes everything. There's no room for anything else." He paused. "That's the part I'm good at. The part where the problem takes everything. And after? After, you feel what you spent the last 3 hours not feeling." He looked at his hands. "Which is fine. That's normal. That's how it works. Do you always sit alone for the after part?" Cyrus said. Remy was quiet. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because the people I work with." He stopped. "The after is mine. I don't know how to share it." Cyrus looked at him. He thought about 6 years of organ transport, about 112 runs that had worked and the 113th that almost hadn't, about the specific arithmetic of a life that had organized itself around the logistics of saving other people's lives and had not, somewhere along the way, left very much room for anything that couldn't be measured in minutes and miles. "I don't either," he said. Remy looked at him. "Share the after," Cyrus said. "I've been doing this for 6 years, and I go home after every transport, and I process it, and I go to sleep, and the next one comes." He paused. "I know exactly how many minutes each heart has. I don't know what I do with my own." The river through the window, the lights on the bridge, Detroit in the small hours doing what cities did, persisting, breathing, moving people from one place to another through the dark. "There's a place on the riverfront," Remy said. "Open late. Not a diner. More like a bar that serves food at 3 a.m. to people who work nights. I know it because I've landed at Detroit Medical 7 times in the past year." 7 times. Cyrus said. "You learn the neighborhood. Do you go there after?" A pause. "I've thought about it," Remy said. "I usually just go back to the hotel." "You're not going to the hotel tonight," Cyrus said. Remy looked at him. "You landed a helicopter with ice on the rotors in the dark, and you got us here," Cyrus said. "And then your hands shook, and you came to a window to look at the river. So," he held Remy's gaze, "you're not going to the hotel." A long moment. Something happened in Remy Fontenot's face that Cyrus had not seen there before. Not in the cockpit, not in the building with the cooler, not in the 40 miles over the ice. Something that was not the calm, something underneath the calm. Visible now the way a riverbed was visible when the water ran clear. Relief. The specific relief of someone who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to simply tell them they didn't have to go alone. "The place on the riverfront," Remy said. Double quotes. "Yes, it's about a 10-minute walk." "I have time," Cyrus said. "The surgery is going to take for hours." Remy looked at him. "You're going to wait for it." "I always wait," Cyrus said. "I've always waited alone." He paused. "I've been doing a lot of things alone." He reached over. He put his hand over Remy's, still in his lap, still carrying the ghost of the shaking, and held it. Not with urgency. Not with the grip of the cooler or the controls. Something that understood that what needed to be held right now was not an organ or a helicopter, but simply a person. In the dark, in the after. Remy turned his hand over. He held on with a careful, Deliberate grip of a man who had flown 40 miles through ice on a one-way ticket and had, it turned out, been flying toward this the whole time. Okay, he said. Okay, Cyrus said. Outside. Detroit ran its river toward the sea. Inside the OR, a surgeon held a heart in her hands and placed it where it needed to go. And the monitor on the wall showed the thing that it needed to show. And somewhere in the city, an 8-year-old girl was asleep, dreaming of soccer trophies and her father's voice and a future she didn't know. Had almost not happened. On the second floor, the waiting room was empty. Remy Fontenot and Cyrus Osman walked out into the Detroit night, and the air was cold and clean after the ice. And the river was right there, and the lights on the bridge were reflected in the water in long yellow columns that moved with the current, and never quite resolved into a pattern, but never quite stopped being beautiful either. They walked. They didn't talk for the first block. They didn't need to. Cyrus had been thinking about something since the field, since the building, since the coffee cups and Gerald's weather radio and Remy walking back out into the ice. He had been thinking about a question that had no professional answer, because it was not a professional question. It was the kind of question you asked when the clock stopped. Who are you when there is no emergency? He looked at Remy walking beside him, the jacket, the hands no longer shaking, the face in the amber street light that was, for the first time since they'd met, not oriented toward a problem, just present, slightly tired, more real somehow than anything that had happened in the cockpit. Who are you when the problem isn't taking everything? He was going to find out. He had time. The surgery was going to take 4 hours. And the transplant coordinator was going to wait. And the pilot was going to stay. And the river was going to keep moving. And the night was going to do what nights did when the worst didn't happen. It was going to become morning. Slowly, without asking permission, the way all the best things arrived.